The glass doors of Highland Crest Bank slid open, allowing a rush of crisp, conditioned air to escape into the warm afternoon. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee mingled with the polished aroma of leather furniture. Every detail of the space, from the deep mahogany desks to the shimmering gold accents, spoke of wealth, of power, of exclusivity. Dorian Bennett stepped in, his tailored blazer resting neatly on his shoulders. He walked with the ease of a man who knew his worth, his confidence earned through years of experience. He had built his consulting firm from nothing, turned skepticism into trust, and proved himself in boardrooms where few had expected him to succeed. Today, however, was not about proving himself. It was about a simple appointment, one scheduled at precisely 11 a.m. The setting, the atmosphere, it was all familiar. He had been in rooms like this before, where money dictated the flow of conversation, where power was unspoken but ever-present. His eyes swept the room, noting the quiet hum of business chatter. Men in tailored suits, women in elegant dresses, all exchanging pleasantries about market trends and investment strategies. These were the people who belonged here, or at least, those who were made to feel that way. Dorian approached the reception desk. Behind it sat a woman named Melissa, her hair neatly pinned into a bun, her expression neutral, almost mechanical. She exuded the kind of efficiency expected in a place like this, quick, impersonal, indifferent. "I have a meeting with Linda Kramer at 11 a.m. His voice was measured, polite but firm. Melissa glanced at her screen, barely sparing him a look. "You're on the schedule," she said. Her tone clipped. "Have a seat. She'll be with you soon." Soon. A vague word. A word that dismissed, that delayed. A word that meant nothing at all. Dorian took a seat near the large floor-to-ceiling windows, where sunlight spilled across the polished floors in crisp, slanted lines. He had arrived early. He always did. Punctuality was a habit of his, a sign of professionalism, of respect for time. But as the minutes ticked by, something unsettled him. At 11:05, a man in a sharp gray suit checked in at the front desk. 5 minutes later, a banker appeared and led him through the frosted glass doors, disappearing into the executive offices. At 11:15, a woman in a cream-colored blazer strolled in. From what Dorian could tell, she had no appointment. She simply exchanged a warm smile with Melissa, shared a brief, pleasant conversation, and was promptly escorted inside. At 11:30, Dorian checked his watch. Something was off. His fingers drummed lightly against his briefcase. He wasn't the only one waiting. But there was a difference. The others were being called. He wasn't. 35 minutes had passed since his scheduled time. 35 minutes of watching others, some without appointments, move ahead of him. 35 minutes of his time disregarded, his presence overlooked. This wasn't about a simple delay. This wasn't a harmless scheduling mishap. This was something else entirely. How would you react? Would you wait patiently? Or would you stand up for yourself? Drop a comment below, and let's discuss. By 11:45, the irritation that had been steadily building in Dorian's chest threatened to break through his carefully maintained composure. He had been patient. He had given them the benefit of the doubt. But as he sat there, watching the minutes tick by, he knew something wasn't right. Pushing himself up from the chair, he made his way back to the reception desk, his expression calm but firm. Melissa glanced up, her fingers still poised over the keyboard, an air of mild exasperation already visible on her face. "Excuse me," Dorian said, his voice controlled but pointed. "Has Linda Kramer been made aware that I'm still waiting?" Melissa exhaled sharply, as if the question had interrupted something far more important than the concern of a waiting client. She barely glanced at the screen before responding. "She knows," she said in a clipped tone. "She's just finishing up with another client." Dorian's jaw tightened. Another client? He had been sitting there for nearly an hour, and no one else had been waiting when he arrived. He had watched people walk in and get taken back almost immediately. And yet here he was. Just as he was about to push further, the glass door swung open again. A woman in a navy blue dress, phone in hand, strode in, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She moved with a practiced ease, the kind that came with knowing she belonged. Melissa's demeanor shifted instantly. The indifference she had shown just moments ago melted into something else, something closer to genuine warmth. "Good morning, Mrs. Lancaster," she greeted, her voice lighter, more polished, almost deferential. Dorian watched as a banker appeared at the woman's side without hesitation, ushering her past the reception desk and through the frosted glass doors. No waiting, no questions, no uncertainty. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had been here for an hour. Mrs. Lancaster had been here for less than a minute. He turned back to Melissa. "So do appointments matter here?" he asked, his tone neutral but deliberate. "Or is it just first come, first served?" For the first time, Melissa's composure faltered. She shifted slightly, her fingers tightening over the keyboard. "I told you, sir," she said, her voice noticeably flatter now. "She'll be with you soon." There it was again. Soon. A word that carried no real meaning. A word that allowed people like Melissa to pretend this wasn't happening. At 12:05, Dorian made his decision. Enough was enough. He stood, adjusting his jacket with a slow, deliberate movement. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to cause a scene. His presence alone would make the statement for him. With quiet determination, he stepped away from the waiting area and walked straight past the reception desk, ignoring Melissa's startled reaction. "Sir," she started, but he didn't stop. Without hesitation, he pushed open the frosted glass doors and stepped inside. Inside, a long hallway stretched before him, lined with private offices on either side. Some doors were left open, revealing muffled conversations and the soft rustling of paperwork. Others remained firmly shut, their occupants engaged in private dealings. The air was thick with the quiet hum of business, the kind that made people feel important, like decisions with real weight were being made behind those frosted glass partitions. At the far end of the hallway, sitting alone at her desk, was Linda Kramer. No clients, no meetings, just her, absorbed in her laptop screen, typing away as if nothing else in the world existed. The sight of her, undisturbed and completely unbothered, sent a fresh wave of irritation through Dorian. He had waited outside for over an hour and a half while she sat here, untouched by urgency. As he stepped inside, her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. She looked up, startled. Surprise flickered across her face before irritation quickly took its place, her expression hardening. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice clipped. "You should have waited to be called." Dorian met her gaze evenly. His expression remained unreadable, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "I did wait," he replied. A tense silence settled between them. The fluorescent lighting overhead buzzed faintly, the only sound in the room aside from the distant murmurs beyond the door. Linda exhaled through her nose, then gestured stiffly toward the chair in front of her desk. "Please take a seat." Dorian lowered himself into the chair, not because she had given him permission, but because he chose to. He set his briefcase beside him, never breaking eye contact with Linda as she shuffled some papers on her desk, her movements deliberate but tense. Her carefully composed mask was slipping, but she fought to hold it in place. "I apologize for the delay," she said, forcing a smile that barely reached her eyes. "We've been extremely busy today." Dorian didn't immediately respond. He let the silence hang between them, watching as she squirmed under his unflinching gaze. Finally, he spoke, his tone controlled, measured. "Busy?" he repeated, the words settling in the air like a challenge. "I watched at least 6 people get taken in before me, some without appointments." Linda's expression remained carefully neutral. "That wasn't intentional," she said smoothly. "There must have been a miscommunication." Before Dorian could respond, the door behind him swung open with a suddenness that shifted the energy in the room entirely. The presence of the 3 men who stepped inside commanded attention. Executives, men who dictated outcomes, who carried weight in spaces like this. And at the front of them stood Richard Langford, CEO of Highland Crest Bank. His sharp eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with practiced efficiency. When they landed on Dorian, something flickered in his expression. Recognition. And not just recognition, respect. "Dorian," he said, his voice shifting from professional detachment to something warmer, more genuine. What the hell are you doing here? Linda stiffened. Her entire demeanor changed. The carefully maintained authority she had projected only moments ago dissolving in an instant. Dorian stood, shaking Richard's hand firmly. Been a while. Richard's easy smile faded as his gaze flickered toward Linda, his demeanor cooling into something far less friendly. How long has Dorian been waiting? He asked. Silence. Linda opened her mouth, but no words came out. She hesitated, scrambling internally for a response that might soften the reality of the situation. Dorian let the moment stretch before answering for her. About an hour and a half, he said, his tone even. Richard's jaw tightened. An hour and a half, he repeated, his voice deceptively calm. You had Dorian Bennett waiting for an hour and a half. Linda shifted uncomfortably. There was a scheduling issue, she started, but Richard didn't even look at her. His focus remained solely on Dorian. You should have called me directly, he said, shaking his head. I would have made sure you were taken care of. Dorian allowed himself a small, knowing smile. Didn't think I needed to. Richard exhaled sharply. The air in the room had shifted completely, and everyone knew it. His next words were short, direct, and final. Step outside. Now. Linda's face paled, her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tightening over the stack of papers in front of her. But she didn't argue. She knew better. With a tight nod, she stood from her desk and exited the office, the door clicking softly shut behind her. The room remained silent for a beat longer, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone present. Richard turned back to Dorian, shaking his head again, his expression unreadable. Let's talk. Richard turned back to Dorian, his expression unreadable, but there was something different in his posture now. A shift, an acknowledgement. I don't know what happened, he admitted, his voice steady but laced with quiet frustration, but I guarantee it won't happen again. The words hung between them, a promise made too late. The damage had already been done, and they both knew it. The tension in the room remained, thick and unmoving, like a stain that wouldn't fade. Linda Kramer was gone, but her actions lingered in the silence she left behind. Dorian let out a breath, slow and measured. He wasn't here for an apology. He wasn't here for a lecture on what should and shouldn't have happened. He was here for business. He tapped his briefcase lightly against his knee, eyes unwavering. Let's talk about that loan application. Richard nodded, already pulling out a chair and motioning for Dorian to sit. The balance of power had shifted now, and they both felt it. Richard was no longer the man in control of the situation. He was the one scrambling to correct an oversight he hadn't even known existed until 5 minutes ago. We'll fast-track it, Richard said, flipping through a stack of papers and retrieving the appropriate documents. You'll have approval on my desk by the end of the day. Dorian raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair slightly. Just like that. Richard met his gaze without hesitation. You should have had it 2 hours ago, he said simply. I'm fixing the mistake. There was nothing more to say. No debate to be had. The decision had already been made, and this was Richard's way of ensuring that the situation didn't spiral further into something more damaging. Dorian nodded once, reaching for the papers. He skimmed through them, his sharp eye catching every number, every clause. Satisfied, he signed where necessary, his signature fluid and confident. He wasn't walking away empty-handed today. When he stood, Richard did the same. He extended a hand. Dorian considered it for a moment before shaking it. Firm and brief. We'll be in touch, Richard said. Dorian gave a small, knowing smile. I'm sure we will. With that, he turned and strode toward the exit. The bank lobby was just as polished as it had been when he walked in, but everything felt different now. The whispered conversations, the glances in his direction. People had noticed what had happened, and that in itself was enough. As he stepped out onto the sunlit pavement, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. A single notification awaited him. New email, loan approved. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He tucked his phone away and walked toward his car, his mind already moving to the next step. Respect isn't given. It's demanded.